The Lagrange John Doe, identified as Kyle Clinksales. Kyle Wade Clinksales went missing on January 27, 1976, from LaGrange, Georgia. The 22-year-old student was around 6 foot tall and had brown hair and hazel eyes. He had been working in the area as a bartender while attending his junior year at Auburn University in Alabama. The towns of LaGrange and the town of Auburn are about 35 miles apart. As a result, he worked at the Moose Club in LaGrange and would make the trip back to his home about 35 miles away. On that final day, he would clock out of work around 11 p.m., which was Tuesday, January 27, 1976, driving back home to his college apartment. However, he would never arrive there, and his 1974 Ford Pinto runabout would go missing along with him. Kyle's family wouldn't learn that he was missing for 5 days, and Kyle would generally call his parents on every Sunday, and when he didn't call, his parents would end up going to his apartment to get a hold of him. Instead, they from his roommate that he hadn't seen Kyle since before he went to work on Tuesday. His family would report him missing in both places, in Auburn and LaGrange. At first, the authorities insisted he'd left of his own accord. They learned that he wasn't doing well at college. He had actually attended and dropped out of a lot of different college classes. That said, it wasn't like him to disappear, and his parents were insistent that he didn't do this on purpose. As time began to pass and there wasn't any word from Kyle, even the police began to admit it was possible foul play had happened. Then in 1981, a man came forward calling himself Danny Moore. He would tell Kyle's family that he had amnesia, but he believes he's actually Kyle, confessing this in a letter to John and Louise Clinksales. He would go on to explain he had been in a car accident in 1976 that led to the amnesia. And of course, 1976 was the year that Kyle went missing. By this time, 5 years had passed. His parents became hopeful. They examined the handwriting, and they thought that did look like Kyle's. However, dental records would eventually confirm that the man was not Kyle at all. On May 27, 1987, a man was walking his dogs along Flat Shoal Creek, which is south of LaGrange. He would notice that an Exxon credit card was laying out. The card itself was described as in excellent condition, and it was Kyle's credit card. However, it was noted that the card itself expired in 1973. Additionally, his parents would note that Kyle had his wallet stolen in 1973. So it's possible, if not probable, that the card came from that missing wallet and whoever had it. Kyle's case would get a lot of headlines in the newspaper, thanks in part to his parents' desperation to find him. In a lot of cases, parents try and can't get the cases written about. I spoke to the family of an 11-year-old boy who went missing. At first, the paper wouldn't write about it because they said he was a runaway, even though he was only 11. And then, when he didn't come back home, they wouldn't write about it because they said too much time had passed. So it's pretty amazing that a local newspaper was willing to do multiple stories on Kyle Clinksales, especially since the police for quite a while believed he left of his own accord. Kyle was even the subject of an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. In 1996, a tip would be received that someone took Kyle's life and then dumped him in a hole behind a local home, and they named the address. This tip was taken seriously, and the property was searched, and it was found to be unfounded. The sheriff even had a lake drained to look for Kyle. 9 more years would pass, and a 35-year-old man would contact Kyle's parents to say he watched a man named Ray Hyde take his life when he was 7, saying that his body was put in a barrel and covered in concrete before being disposed of in a pond, saying that his grandfather had helped dispose of the remains after the young man and the grandfather were threatened. The tip would lead to 2 arrests, though not of the man named Ray Hyde. Instead, it somehow led to the arrest of a 63-year-old man named Jimmy Earl Jones and a woman named Jeannie Pollock Johnson. The arrest would take place in April of 2005. Jones was charged with concealing a death as well as hindering a criminal arrest and making 2 false statements. Johnson was also charged with the same as well as obstructing justice. Witnesses would place her at Jimmy Earl Hyde's home during the night in question, but she denied being there. They were further linked to Kyle by being members of the Moose Club where Kyle bartended. It was surmised that his life was taken because he overheard something of Hyde's criminal activities while working. Jones would later tell police on the night Kyle vanished, he had arrived at Hyde's home and discovered Kyle's body, where Hyde would admit this was the result of a GS. Jones would then admit that he helped Hyde drag Kyle into his shop. Hyde told Jones that after placing Kyle in a pond, he would change his mind and pull him back out, moving him to an undisclosed location. They didn't paint a complete picture, and the statements often contradicted each other. This would eventually lead to Jones being deemed an unreliable witness. He would later end up pleading guilty to false statements and serving 7 of a 9-year sentence. While Jones would eventually do prison time, it's not clear if Jeannie Johnson ever did. On December 7, 2021, the police would receive another tip. As many of us know who watch the YouTube channel Adventures with Purpose, when an entire car disappears along with a human, it's often a case that the car has been submerged in water somewhere, often with the person inside. In this case, a witness called to say they could see a car submerged in a creek in Caseta, Alabama. This is about 30 miles from LaGrange and about 20 miles from Auburn. The car was removed from the water and quickly matched via the VIN and license plate to the missing person case of Kyle Clinksales. They would test his DNA to confirm he was in fact Kyle. They haven't released yet what the COD was. If it comes out while I'm syncing the video up with this audio, you will find an editor's note on the screen. So far, it's unknown if his car came to the water as an accident or if there truly was a crime. Unfortunately, Kyle's parents never found out what happened to the son they didn't quit looking for. John passed in 2007 at the age of 82. His mother, Louise, passed more recently, in January of 2021. Much closer, but still too soon to know what happened to Kyle. He was identified in February of 2023, 26 months after Louise passed. Kyle Wade Clinksales was missing for 47 years. Had he lived the life his parents so fervently wished for him, he would be 69 years old today. The Lady of the Hills, identified as LamDuan Armitage. The case comes to us from the UK. Before I dig in, I want to say I know a lot of subscribers live in other countries. If you have cases you would like to submit, please email them to me at the email address found below this video. Sometimes I'm slow, but I will always respond. On September 20th, 2004, a man was out walking on Pennine Way, which is between Pennigent and Horton in Ribblesdale. It wasn't even an isolated area. It was an area that is often traveled by people. The man stopped to take a photograph by a stream, not realizing that in the back of the photo, a woman could be seen by the rock. And this was within the stream that was named Sel Gilbeck. It was likely the woman had been there for 3 weeks. Her COD hadn't been discovered, so no one was able to tell what had happened. She was wearing only green socks and a wedding ring. A ripped bra was hanging from one arm. Law enforcement tried really hard to discover who she was. They felt she may have been from Southeast Asia, but of course, that is just ancestry. She could be a foreign national or a UK resident. They knew she was of medium build and had a gap in her lower teeth. They also knew she'd given birth to a child in the past. As they began working the case, they began to believe she was what they referred to as a Thai bride. The community paid for a funeral and a headstone, which always deserves inclusion in these cases because the kindness of people towards someone without a name is always pretty amazing. They say that they felt a responsibility toward the woman and that they wanted her to have a place that her family could go to should she ever get traced. For them, the kindness was to her family in addition to a nameless woman. More than 40 people would attend her funeral. The police would go on to question those who had been walking in the area in hopes that someone might have known or seen something. They even went to a house in the area, in the local village, looking for witnesses. It would be determined that the woman had passed between September 13, 2004 to August 31, 2004. It was later called an unexplained death rather than suspicious or foul play. The isotope test pointed to Singapore, Thailand, or Vietnam. They believed she lived in the UK for about 2 years. This was a big complication if, for no other reason other than people missing her might live in another country and speak another language. This is eventually what led to her being referred to as the Thai bride. It also suggests she may have been at a higher risk for someone taking advantage of her or hurting her, should that be true. Testing done on her hair would narrow down her location to having lived in a rural community in North Lancashire or the South Cumbria areas of the United Kingdom. Her case was shown in a British version of Crime Watch in 2004. An inquest would be held in May of 2007, determining, essentially, that they could not determine her COD. Sorry for the coded words. Again, it's hard to know exactly what YouTube will penalize me for, so I've been trying to be more cautious. They did, however, rule out drowning, which I would think makes it more suspicious given where she was found. That said, it also was just a small stream, as evidenced in the photograph here. The water in that spot comes out of what is described as a small cave. In early 2019, LamDuan's family in Thailand would come forward to say that they believed the Lady of the Hills was actually their missing daughter, LamDuan Armitage. DNA testing was done on her remains and compared to the family, eventually concluding that they were in fact correct. After 15 years, they had finally found their missing daughter. Once they had her name, authorities would discover that Lam had been married once prior to meeting the man she was married to when she disappeared. She eventually met and married British lecturer David Armitage when Armitage was living in the northern Thai city, Chiang Mai. He had moved there to teach English around the time that LamDuan had moved there to find a job, after her first marriage fell apart. Lam had been living in a small village, but she had hopes of finding better employment options and a life for the child she now needed to support. She found a job working part-time in a restaurant, and that was where she met Armitage. The couple didn't date very long before they got married. They would tie the knot in Thailand in January of 1991. About 6 months later, the two would move with Lam's son from her prior marriage to Portsmouth in the UK. Armitage would go on to have a male child in February of 1992. Around 1994, their marriage began to struggle as they were trying to have another child, and it wasn't happening. There was the added stressor of the fact she was getting pregnant, but she would have miscarriages. They would eventually conceive a daughter in May of 1999. But by then, the marriage was pretty unhappy, and it stayed that way. According to Lam's parents, she sent a letter home to them saying she wanted to leave her husband, but that she feared a custody battle over her children. She couldn't take it anymore, though, and she returned home to Thailand, leaving her children behind. She stayed there for a month in 2004. It's not clear why she left them behind, but likely her husband either refused to allow her to take them or she was in fear of a legal response. But she missed her kids and couldn't take it, and after that month returned home. But she would tell her mother in a letter that she felt trapped. Her marriage eventually reached another breaking point. She would speak to her parents on the phone once a week, most weeks, and on her last call home, she would say she wanted to come back to Thailand permanently with the children, but that she doesn't have enough money yet to do so. That was the last conversation they ever had. No phone calls would happen after this, and no more letters were received. Her parents would try to reach her by phone, but the phone had already been shut off. They would report her missing to the police in Thailand after 4 weeks. The missing persons report would eventually make its way to the UK. Her husband was approached by the police once his wife was reported missing. It appears he refused to answer any questions, simply insisting that his wife move back to Thailand. He doesn't know where she is, and he wants them to leave him alone. He also said he would not be discussing his marital problems with the police. He said the same thing to her parents. The police would approach her husband once again after she was identified by DNA, saying that he knew nothing of her passing, and he had nothing to do with it. This was all complicated by the fact that her COD was never found, so it's hard to prove he even did anything to her. One shocking quote appears to say the quiet part out loud. disclosing what her husband feels about the loss of his wife. He would tell a newspaper, quoted as saying, "I'm bored with it all," and then continue on to say, "I just want to go on with work." He would do his best to relay that he was unconcerned about the mother of his children and whatever led to her being unidentified for 15 years. At some point after she was identified, he moved back to and was living in Thailand. He did share some concerns publicly, but not for the loss of his wife. Rather, the concern was for himself and the fact that police in the UK have questioned him at all. He relayed that he was angry that they were treating him with anything other than pity as a man who'd lost his wife. He would say that they should have been treating him as a bereaved husband. He continued on to say that if the police want to formally speak to me, I'll of course cooperate, saying I made that very clear to the British Embassy. My position is that I have nothing to hide, so why wouldn't I talk to them? Except it appears that is exactly what he did, even moving away from the UK, possibly to avoid this. Her parents, for their part, have been very clear that they believe she met with foul play and that her husband is behind it. He has made himself out to be a victim of her family and of the British police. He would say that a man from the British Embassy contacted him in Thailand to say that the embassy was concerned regarding his wife's passing, saying that they were afraid that her family would come and try to hurt him. There's no indication if this conversation actually took place. In 2023, British law enforcement decided to take him up on his offer that he made to the British Embassy. After avoiding them, they would fly all the way to Thailand to talk to David Armitage, telling him that they want to question him. Probably not a huge surprise to anyone, but Mr. Bored by it all refused to speak to the police. He wouldn't even take the time to share the pain and bereavement he feels at the loss of his wife, saying nothing at all. But as suspicious as this is, they haven't been able to obtain any proof that he did anything to his wife. A wife that, I might add, he did not bother to report missing. Lam's daughter currently lives with her father in Thailand. Her son lives in China, where he works as a teacher. Her oldest son lives in the UK. LamDuan Armitage went unidentified for 14 years. Had she lived, she would be 54 today. The Port Angeles Jane Doe, identified as Geralyn Smith. Geralyn Smith and her husband lived in Sequim, Washington on January 6, 2018. The couple would go to bed, but for some reason, Jerilyn's husband of 50 years would get up and go to sleep on the couch, saying he planned to go to church early the next morning. He would say that he did so without checking on Jerry. When he returned home, he would note that her vehicle was gone, and he eventually located it parked near the Eel River Bridge, which is located west of Port Angeles. Divers would go to the scene and search the river below, as well as along the beaches. In fact, search crews also went out on kayaks, and the Coast Guard flew a helicopter over the waterway, hoping to find her, but there was no sign of Jerry at all. Then in December of 2021, a shoe containing a foot was found near the mouth of the Eel River in Port Angeles, Washington. It was found and reported to the sheriff's office, who would recover the shoe from the site, and they would try to find more pieces, but nothing was ever found. She was wearing a size 8 women's New Balance brand tennis shoe. The case was a little bit more difficult if you consider how limited the remains were. For obvious reasons, they couldn't list any identifying factors like ethnicity, height, or eye color. The sheriff tried really hard to solve the woman's identity, but DNA was really the only option. Thankfully, the fundraising arm of Authorin Labs, which is DNA Solves, would come into the picture, and they would crowdfund the cost for processing her DNA and doing genetic genealogy. Authorin actually has their own in-house genealogical team that then tends to this. They would find someone who was close in scope, and that person believed the remains could belong to Jerry, who they would report went missing. Other members would provide their own DNA, which would, in turn, provide her name. It's hard to know exactly what happened, but her family would say that Jerry had struggled with depression for years and had considered harming herself before. I've made it my personal goal to share mental health information on this channel, so I just wanted to say that if you find yourself feeling hopeless and struggling with depression or thoughts of taking your own life, you can simply dial 988 and it will route it to the nearest local chapter of an assistance hotline. It's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There are over 17 million people in the U.S. with depression, including myself. Jerry was missing for 5 years. She went unidentified for 1. Anyone with any information is asked to call the number on the screen. Jerry was found 16 miles away from where she went missing. She left behind her husband of 50 years and their 4 children and 8 grandchildren. Had she lived, she'd be 73 years old today. The Lamp John Doe, identified as Theodore Teddy Long, and the Youngstown John Doe, identified as Robert Sanders. The cases of Teddy Long and Robert Sanders weave in and out together, which is why I'm going to do something I've not done before and present the 2 cases at once. So just to be clear, no one thinks the same person took the lives of either young man, even though there's similarities between the 2. The truth is that no one thinks the same person did this, but the reason the 2 are linked is the case of the Youngstown John Doe eventually led to the identification of the Lamp John Doe. One case actually helped solve the other, leading to both men reclaiming their names in February of 2023. In the case of the Youngstown John Doe, he was found by hunters not wearing any clothing in a creek in Mahoning County in 1987. His COD was undetermined. The case of the other man is that of the Lamp John Doe, and he was found in Fayette County in 1981 by a grandfather and his grandson who were out squirrel hunting. The Lamp John Doe was discovered with 2 GS wounds to his chest and eventually named the Lamp John Doe because he was found near Lamp Road in Fayette County, Ohio. In August of 2022, the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, which is the BCI, would meet with the Ohio County Attorney. They did a 3D rendering of the Youngstown John Doe found in 1987, in hopes that the 3D rendering would jumpstart the cold cases. They believed him to be a black male between the ages of 30 and 44. As with the Lamp John Doe, authorities tried and failed to identify him. While they were able to rule out specific missing persons, neither jurisdiction was able to find the answers they needed. Tips would come into the police once the sketch was released, however, and they found the lead that would lead to identification, only it was not the Youngstown John Doe that was identified. A friend of a man named Teddy Long would approach the police when the images of the Youngstown John Doe were released. They had come to believe that the man could be their friend Teddy. The detectives quickly realized the missing person being discussed wasn't their John Doe, but they were aware of a case in another area of Ohio. They felt this might be a promising lead, and it was. So they passed the lead on, forwarding the information to the BCI, which then found it related to remains dating back to 1981. The tip proved to be the missing piece of information that would lead to the identification of Theodore Long, a 19-year-old man from Toledo. How and why Teddy was around 700 miles away from home is unknown, but it was likely far enough that his family and friends might not have heard about the John Doe case. Not much is known about Teddy Long other than he was 19. If his parents reported him missing, the report has been lost. Without a family member saying they were not reported, I honestly no longer believe any claim that they did not. Way too many cases have people saying that they were reported missing and the paperwork has vanished. Additionally, there was a problem back then with many jurisdictions refusing to even take a missing person case, saying an adult has a right to go missing, therefore they don't qualify as a missing person. Thankfully, that's not the case anymore. The refusal to take those reports meant there was nobody to match the cases up with. We do know now, unfortunately, that Teddy's mother passed away without knowing what happened to her son. Her family is hoping that a suspect will soon come to light with tips being called in. That's why it's so important to call if you know anything about Teddy's movements. His sister is speaking to the sheriff about possibly moving his grave closer to where she lives. Theodore Long went unidentified for 41 years. He was found 700 miles away from where he went missing. Robert Earl Sanders, the Youngstown John Doe. They released the 3D rendering of the Youngstown John Doe, and while the tips led to the identification of Teddy Long, it still left the Youngstown John Doe needing to be identified. They would eventually use DNA and genetic genealogy to narrow down the Doe's name through Porchlight Project. This is mainly funded by a program called Nick and the Captain True Crime Garage. They are acknowledged by Othram and their site DNA Solves in helping with the identification of this case. The original assessment had believed the remains to be of an African American male between 30 and 44. Genealogy would soon discover that Robert Earl Sanders was the young man found. It turns out he was just 4 years older than Teddy Long, as he was 23 when he went missing, and this was in 1976. There is an 11-year gap between his family reporting him missing and when his skeletal remains were found. It is interesting the police didn't match the missing man to the remains, because we know for a fact he was reported missing and that report was still in existence. Anyone with information regarding Robert Sanders is asked to come forward and provide information on his movements. Whatever happened to him is currently undetermined. Robert's friends and family may be able to help fill in the necessary information. Robert Earl Sanders was missing for 46 years. He was an unidentified John Doe for 35. Had he lived, Robert would be 69 years old today. Granby Girl, identified as Patricia Tucker. Before I start this video, I just want to say thank you to all of you who have consistently commented on the videos here. It's the engagement that makes a huge difference, and the channel finally has 10,000 subscribers, which took about 2 years and 200 videos to reach, so I want to thank everybody. On November 15th, 1978, a woman was found by loggers. They believe she'd been there 3 months to a year and was around 19 to 27 years old. A GSW was the cause. Genetic genealogy would eventually lead to a niece who would share that her aunt went missing in the 1970s, saying that when her aunt disappeared, she left behind 2 children. Those children were then approached by the genealogist asking for a sample and leading to a 100% chance of a parent-child match. Patricia Tucker's family finally knew the reason that then 28-year-old Patricia never returned for her kids. She couldn't. Patricia Tucker's story seems to be different depending on the account. Because there's so much coverage on this case, I dug deeper, but it differs where she was last seen by her son. And both can't be right. I'm going to give one account and then the other, because I don't want to get it wrong. Quite a few of these articles say that her son, Matthew, last remembers her dropping him off at some sort of a juvenile facility in Boston, Massachusetts. Matthew would reportedly tell authorities that the last memory he has of his mom is that she was in the front seat of a stranger's car and he had no idea who the man was. The year was 1978 and he was only 5, so his memory is a little sketchy. He remembers the upholstery of the back seat where his legs didn't quite even stretch to the floor. We know that she was married to Gerald Coleman at the time in 1977, and that Gerald Coleman is considered a suspect. But he himself passed in 1996. One thing the article doesn't elaborate on is if Gerald Coleman, who would be the boy's stepfather, was someone the son knew. It almost sounds like it's someone else that was in the car with them. I would think if she was married for a year that the son would know and recognize Gerald Coleman. But of course, his age makes this really hard. It's so easy for a child to remember something wrong. So it is impossible, if not unlikely, that the man in the car wasn't Gerald Coleman in 1978. This is just my own guess, however. It's also very strange that she would drop him off at what was described as a home for juveniles, especially since he was age 5. It makes no sense. Maybe things were different then than it would be later on, but the whole thing seems sketchy. Generally, such a place would be court-ordered, involving maybe juvenile delinquency. It bothered me enough that I looked into it, and I couldn't dig up a way for this to be true. Starting in the early 1990s, which is obviously a lot after this, but I did a lot of internships and worked as a program director at a youth mentoring agency, as I mentioned before, and then later in mental health. So my point is that I kind of know the system, and this doesn't make any sense at all. And then it said that the mom basically dropped him off at a park across the street from the place and left. Also doesn't make any sense. But her son would say that he remembers crossing the street to the playground and her telling him goodbye, and right after that leaving. So perhaps she did leave him at a facility just hoping they would care for him. However, it kept bothering me, so I kept digging, and I found something different eventually. I found one article that would say that Patricia Ann Tucker married Gerald Jerry Coleman in 1977 in Middletown, Connecticut in April of 1978, and that the two would purchase a home in East Hampton, Connecticut. It would state that Matthew would say that Patty dropped him off for the last time at a home on Taylor Street in Chicopee, Massachusetts, which very much was not supposed to be some sort of juvenile home. This makes way more sense. The town he was dropped off in is about 10 miles away from East Hampton, where her home was. And in this accounting, he said he was dropped off in August of 1978 with a woman named Laura Holmes, saying the woman was just supposed to watch him for a few hours, but that his mother never returned. Part of the problem, of course, is that this is 44 years ago, and why she left him or didn't return is lost to time. It's possible she left him on purpose thinking she was protecting him, rather than abandoning him, or it's possible something happened to her at that same time. We know that Jerry Coleman was not a good guy. He was arrested in 1968 for attempted kidnapping and was no stranger to the system, being arrested for R&A. His arrests are bad enough that I can't even state them because of YouTube's policies. He died in 1996, and for some reason there is a photo of him taken in a post-mortem exam if anyone needs to know what he looked like and whether or not they remember something. I can't show the photo here. There's just no way to use it appropriately. But the photo's out there. I did find a booking photo from earlier in his life, and that photo can be seen here. We do know that Jerry didn't report his wife missing, and right now it appears he's the best suspect. Matthew would say the mystery of his mother's disappearance always bothered him, and his family members had a lot of theories. Some were far-fetched, like she had entered witness protection. It wasn't until his 30s that Matthew finally came to terms with the idea that his mom was no longer alive, and that something had happened to her. Matthew attended the news conference where her identification was announced in March of 2023, saying, "First, I would like to say thank you to everyone in trying to identify my mother and for wrapping your arms around her, especially the community of Granby. Thank you for never giving up on her. At least I have some answers now after 44 years. It's a lot to process, but hopefully the closure can now begin. Thank you." He also mentioned that she had fallen in with the wrong crowd in another interview, saying that she wasn't a hiker and where she was found made no sense. It appears he grew up with his father, who passed away in 2015. Matthew would say his father's passing left him feeling a little untethered, without living parents. He's now happily married and has kids himself. It's not clear what happened to Patty's other child. The DA would say at this time there is no probable cause to charge anyone with the demise of Patricia. The DA's office hopes to find more leads to help further the identification. Patricia Tucker went unidentified for 44 years. Had she lived, she would be 72 today. The lady in the fridge, also known as the Stockton Jane Doe, identified as Amanda Schumann-Deza. In March of 1995, a man was out looking for recyclable objects and change. He was mainly scoping the area for coins as well as cans, things that he could recycle in an area 10 miles away from Stockton, California. Instead, he found the gold 1983 Frigidaire refrigerator pictured here. It had been shoved down into a canal. It wasn't easy to get to, but he managed, and he found that it had been tied shut with a rope and dumped into the levee. The treasure hunters would then cut through the rope and open the fridge. They were at first met with a waterbed quilt and a sleeping bag, but then inside they found a woman, along with a lot of water. It's a little shocking how many people are found in freezers and refrigerators. An examination of the woman pointed to blunt force trauma to her head, likely in August of 1994 to February of 1995, meaning she'd been there for 1 month to 6 months before she was found, suggesting she was 5'5" and 24 to 45 years old. She had no tattoos or scars that they could tell, and her nails had been freshly manicured. It was discovered that someone had gagged her with a sock and bound her with electrical tape. Her teeth were in good condition. She didn't appear to be somebody who was likely a transient. So it seems safe to assume that some family member somewhere was missing her, and that someone might come forward. The authorities detailed a white blanket and a blue blanket and a Hillary brand sleeping bag, yet nobody came forward. Additionally, she appeared to be married or perhaps divorced, as she was wearing a 1-carat diamond ring on her right ring finger. She was also perhaps of some means, as she had gorilla hiking boots on. Those cost $120 in 1996, which is about $379 in today's currency. There also appeared to be some pieces of jewelry and some leather that appeared to be part of a charm necklace with large ornaments. Although they couldn't name her, they were able to link all of the items to local origin, believing they came from Richmond, Antioch, Pittsburgh, Oakley, and Brentwood, which is all relatively close. Someone had originally packed her with unopened bags of ice from Glacier Ice Company, which was produced in Fremont and traced to the East Bay. Miniature milk cartons were found inside, which were the kind you find in schools. The refrigerator itself was manufactured in Pennsylvania and sold in Oakland. So she, or whomever did this to her, was from the area, if not both. It would take genetic genealogy to eventually find her name. They were able to use the DNA profile to locate her mother, eventually identifying her as Amanda Schumann-Deza. Amanda was 30 when someone took her life. Her family didn't report her missing because they had no idea where she was. They had believed her to be out there living her life somewhere, and were completely shocked by the news that all that time she had been gone. After they gave their DNA, there was a match to both mother and child. The sheriff's department would give this statement: Amanda is a daughter, she's a sister, she's a mother, she's a friend. We're missing several pieces to the years prior to her disappearance and her death, and we hope you will recognize Amanda and reach out to us. They would learn that Amanda had separated from her husband, and the two had 3 young children. Amanda was last seen at an apartment complex in Napa with a man they believed she met at a rehabilitation facility. The daughter, who would eventually give her DNA to identify her mother, would say that she was 3 and had been removed from her mother's home. She knew nothing of what had happened to her mother, and her only memories were of her mother being sweet and loving. In all of the years after this, she would always have a clear feeling of having been loved by her mother. The now 34-year-old woman's only memory was playing in the sand with her mom. She would say, "I've lived my whole life just not knowing. She was gone and I never knew why. I thought that she had just left us. I felt left." There isn't a lot of information about her life before. She doesn't know exactly why she or her siblings were removed from their mother's care. The 3 kids were eventually placed in the same foster home, and they were adopted together. The kids had a good life. It was a happy ending compared to what might have happened. Her daughter would say she believes her mom did the best that she could. She would always feel her mom loved her, saying it was like her mom got lost. She doesn't believe her mother had the support that she needed to thrive. Nothing is said about the husband and father of the children. If it's known, it was not shared in the articles that I found. Her daughter did say she was saddened by the unfairness of it all, that it was unjust in the brutal way her life was taken. There's a $10,000 reward in this case, in hopes that it will lead to whoever did this. They need people who knew Amanda to come forward. They believe that Amanda lived in Napa, Oakley, and the California Delta after she was separated from her family. Because her daughter is 34 and was 3 when she was taken from her mom's home, that means roughly 2 to 3 years are unaccounted for. So it's important that anyone who knew Amanda come forward. Amanda Lynn Schumann-Deza went unidentified for 27 years. Had she lived, she would be 56 years old today. She was found 85 miles away from where she went missing. The Eel River John Doe, identified as Jeffery Todd Sydow. This story begins in March of 1998 in Lolita, California. A man was out with his father searching the Eel River by boat for driftwood. They would locate something they thought might be a person near Robbins Island, but they weren't even sure. They would contact the sheriff, and deputies would use a jet boat to recover what was identified as partially clothed remains. It would eventually be determined to belong to a man around 5'10" who was 35 to 45, who had likely drowned. But no one from Northern California had been reported missing in that area, and they hit a wall. DNA would make its way into CODIS, but no one else had submitted their own DNA, so there was no match. As I always like to mention, if you're missing somebody, really you should submit your DNA if NamUs. There is a link below this video on how to do that. It's only searched by the Missing Person program. You don't have to worry about it being intrusive otherwise. The three main means of identification are fingerprints, dental films, and DNA. And they were actually able to pull one print, but it wasn't in the system either. They very much tried to identify him, but it just wasn't possible at the time. Once again, Othram Labs has come in to save the day. It's not usually normally possible to get DNA when someone is in the water for so long, or at least it's very hard. They've established procedures that take time and work, but they did it here again. Funding in this case was provided by Roads to Justice, which is part of the Ford Foundation Center for Social Justice. The Ford Center for Social Justice offers grants. A quick fact about this is that the Ford Foundation, it was funded by Henry Ford and his wife in the 1940s with stock, and no fundraising has ever been done since. It was this grant and Othram Labs that led to Jeffery Todd Sydow once again having a name. The DNA they were able to get led to a possible sister in Missouri, and she was the key. Jeffery was born in 1963, but he lost contact with his family in the mid-1990s. And of course, he was found in 1998, which leaves a little bit of a gap that could be filled and help the family understand what happened by contacting authorities with what they know of his movements. His sister has looked for and tried to reach him over the years. Because he wasn't in contact with them, he wasn't reported missing. They didn't know where he even was. Jeffery's family is working with Humboldt County to move him for burial for the rest of their family, reunited at last. Jeffery Todd Sydow went unidentified for 24 years. Had he lived, he would be 59 years old today. The Spencer Island John Doe, identified as Gary Haney. It started in January of 1979 on Spencer Island near Marysville, Washington, when a man was out hunting. That man would discover someone in the tide flats near Spencer Island, finding someone stuck in the fishing lines. But who he was and why he was there would stump law enforcement. They couldn't even determine the COD. Over the years, they would do dental films and keep records, but with so many of these cases, the written records just disappeared, lost in storage, or were thrown away. It's hard to say what exactly happened. We know there was more work done, but like the original records from 1979, everything in the 1980s sort of disappeared. The coroner's office converted to a medical examiner's office in 1987. And from that point on, better records were kept, but it was too late for the Spencer Island Doe. Back then, they tended to bury the person. Later on, they would exhume him from what was originally assumed would be his final resting place in 2015 in hopes of finding DNA. They redid his dentals, this time in putting them into a database, but they didn't turn up any matches. A forensic artist named Natalie Murray would do a recreation based on facial morphology. Facial morphology is a series of many different complex traits, each influenced by genetic and environmental factors. Often the recreations are the largest stepping stone to identification. They would keep trying to identify the man, placing him between 5'2" and 5'6" and 27 to 61 years old. They knew he had an unset, well-healed left femur fracture, and that he must have walked with a limp because of this. His DNA was uploaded to CODIS in 2018, but again, there were no matches. This would lead to a more advanced DNA profile being drawn up in 2021. One different thing about this is it wasn't GEDmatch, so it was the newest form of checking that led to the answer, and that is family tree DNA. My DNA is in both of these, and to be honest, family tree is so much better in my opinion. So it's exciting that this is being used more. It's easier to see what matches are connected. or at least easier for a novice like me. They finally traced the ancestors to Everett, Washington in the late 1970s, finding a branch that would lead to Gary Lee Haney's half-sister. She would explain that Gary was around 29 when he went missing. I'm going to do the best I can to include photos of him, but currently all I have are photos where he was a lot younger from his grandmother's photo album. And anytime I use younger photos or mentions an age that's a lot younger, YouTube shuts off comments because the idea is to avoid those in that age group from being bullied. But obviously, my videos are not that. But there's no way to protest. So I'm going to do the best I can to include photos of him, but if there's no photos in here, that is why. If they shut off the comments, it tanks the video completely. Nobody even sees it. If Gary was reported missing, it was lost just as his records were over those years. As they needed genetic DNA, his femur was mailed to Othram Labs in hopes that would lead to an identification. And after 44 years, Gary's name was announced on March 3, 2023. Gary was born in Topeka, Kansas, traveling the world with his mother and adoptive father, because his father was in the Air Force. However, his parents have since passed, and no one really knows exactly how Gary even disappeared, much less how he came to be where he was found. The photos of Gary are scarce and hard to come by, but I'll dig again when I'm editing the audio, and if more appear online that I find, I'll include it in this video. We know that Gary was born Gary Joseph Condomiti. His brother divorced Gary's father, marrying Sheldon Haney, who would adopt Gary as his own. Gary's biological dad passed when Gary was 16. But Gary stepped away from his family, and some of them believe he was struggling with his mental health. Sheldon Haney lived in Everett, Washington from the early 1970s until 1990. No one really knows where Gary was. He may have been living with Sheldon, or Sheldon may have known where he was, but it was never stated to anyone else. We know that the family legally declared Gary deceased in 1976, but that he didn't actually pass until 1979. So tracing him to late 1978 may give the best answers. The weird thing is, too, that Sheldon never mentioned Gary or his absence. If anyone knows what happened to him or how he ended up where he was found, please contact the number on the screen. Gary Lee Haney went unidentified for 44 years. Had he lived, he would be 73 years old today. The Linn County Jane Doe, identified as Grace Narvaez-Weaver. In April of 2020, the remains of a woman were found in an extremely remote area. This was a wooded area off of U.S. Forest Service Road in Linn County, Oregon. This was about 13 miles east of Sweet Home, Oregon. While it was essentially in the middle of nowhere, it's still somewhat well-traveled, approximately 5 miles into Gordon Road, off of U.S. Forest Service Road 417. If they knew her COD, they didn't release it. So it's not clear if they believed it to be foul play. Sometimes they hold off on this, waiting for the person's identity before they dig into anything else related to the case, so that might be the reason. The authorities would release that they believed she was white, around 30 to 50. With these newer cases, they are quicker to use DNA to try to identify them. Bode technology has a great ability to make a likeness based on her genetics. This was the image that they built up. Usually they're pretty close as far as what the person looks like. It's a pretty incredible tool, actually. In addition to this, her DNA was added to CODIS in hopes of identifying her, but there were no hits. They eventually resorted to genetic genealogy in late 2022, eventually announcing on March 8, 2023, that the woman was in fact Grace Lorna Narvaez-Weaver. In this case, Grace was last seen at the post office in July of 2019, but not in Oregon. Rather, she was seen in Olympia, Washington, which is about 200 miles away. Grace was dealing with an undisclosed type of mental illness. Her loved ones were missing her and wanting to know if she was okay. They did report her missing once it was clear they couldn't find her, but even that is a little up in the air since she didn't have a home to look for her at. Like so many before her, Grace was living on the streets and struggling. That often leads to a gap in time before the report happens. Her family reported that Grace was 47 when she went missing in 2019. Grace had a seizure disorder and she required medication, which understandably worried them when she disappeared. The last time they saw her, she was in the company of a man that they didn't know. So far, they haven't released anything about the man, such as a sketch, but if anything comes up before I finalize the video, it will show up right here. I always like to warn you because sometimes then my audio won't match up with what you're seeing. If anyone knows anything about Grace and what she was up to at the time, please contact the number on your screen. It doesn't appear she had a vehicle and she made her way to Oregon somehow. The investigation into her case is still ongoing. Grace Weaver went unidentified for 2 years. She was missing for 3. She was found 200 miles away from where she went missing. Had she lived, she would be 50 years old today.
As always, thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you don't miss new episodes. So if you enjoy the content here and you're not sure, take a peek to see if you're subscribed. Take care of yourselves and each other.